So we have seen that what the factors responsible for the occurrence of tides. Yes, what are the factors responsible for the occurrence of tide? Low tide and high tide. What are they? The gravitational pull of the moon and the sun as well as that of the earth. Then revolution of the earth around the sun and the indirect revolution of the moon around the sun. Then centrifugal force generated due to the rotation of the earth. These three factors you have to learn, you have to keep it in mind. Okay, class? Okay. Now I hope you all have understood. We have seen that how if it is high tide in the 0 degree meridian, the opposite meridian will also experience high tide, and which meridian will experience the low tide? The which which is in the right angle. Okay, clear. Now we are going to see types of tide. Yeah. Now low tide and high tide is different. What happens in low tide? Okay, first of all, tell me. I hope you all understand. What happens in low tide? In low tide, the quantity of water decreases, and in high tide, the quantity of water increases. Okay. Now there are different types of tides. What are they? Why? Because the position of the sun, the moon, and the earth changes. According to that, the types are named. Okay, so we are going to see that types. As the as the timing of tide varies every day the timing of tide varies. It is not like that if it is at 5 o'clock they are going to experience high tide, tomorrow also 5 o'clock they will experience. No, the range of tide also keeps on changing. Generally, the highest high tides occur on full moon and new moon days. Yes, keep this in mind. High tide. Generally, the highest means the quantity of water. The water level increases a lot. Generally, the highest high tide occurs on full moon and new moon days, whereas on the days of the first and third quarter, the high tide is at its minimum and the level of water is very less on first and the third quarter. Now, this we have seen in the phases of the moon. Yes, you all should know this. Clear? When it is high tide, highest high tide, full moon and new moon, and when it is minimum, high tide is at its minimum on the first and third quarter. Okay, so spring tides and neap tides are the two types of tides. What are the two types of tides? Spring tides and neap tides. What? Spring tides and neap tides. Okay. Now we will see what is spring tide. Please listen carefully, all of you. On the new moon and full moon days, what are we going to see? Spring tide. You can see over here spring tide. Clear? So on new moon and full moon days, the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon act in the same direction. See, on the new moon and full moon day, how is the position? See, the sun, moon. See here. Sun, moon, earth. Can you see, all of you? Yes, sun, moon and earth. Can you see the direction? The sun, the moon act in the same direction. Okay. Due to this, the total pull increases. Definitely, sun's gravitational pull, moon's gravitational pull. So, force is going to be more. Am I right? Yes. So, hence the tide on these days is much higher than the average high tide. Means every day we experience tide, but the high tide is more on the new moon and full moon because the why? Because moon, the pull, the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon together, okay, their force is greater. Why? Because it is combined pull of the sun and of the moon. Clear? Hence, the tide on these days is much higher than the average high tide. This is known as a spring tide. What is spring tide? When the sun, the moon and the earth are in the same direction and the sun and the moon's gravitational pull is more. Okay. See figure 3.7. As the bulge, see the bulge, you can see the bulge. This is the bulge. This is the bulge you can see over here. Can you see this bulge? Okay. The bulge on the high tide is greater. The water of low tide recedes much, and where they experience the low tide, there the water is very less, and here they can experience more water. Where there is a bulge. This is a bulge. I will write over here. B-U-L-G-E. Bulge. Understood? B-U-L-G-E. Bulge. Okay. So, as the bulge of the high tide is greater, the water at low tide recedes much more. The water level during spring tide is higher than the average high tides and lower than the average low. Now what? Means when it is spring tide. When is spring tide? On basically on the new moon and full moon. Why? Because the position of the sun and the moon is in the same direction, because of which the pull, the gravitational force is more. So what happened at that time? In that direction where the gravitational pull is more, there is a bulge and there it experiences the high tide, and where they are going to experience low tide, the level of water is very less. Okay? Understood all of you? Understood? Okay? So, this is what the spring tide is. You have to keep this in mind. You have to keep this in mind, this image, this picture, so that you can understand it in a better way. So here they will experience low tide where the water level is very less. Here they will experience high tide where the water level is very high. Clear? Similarly, fall in water level is less than usual. Similarly, fall in water level is less than usual at the time of low tide. This is because the attraction of the sun and the moon are not complementary but at right angles to each other. What is neap tide? See here. See here. The sun's gravitational pull is here. See here. And now moon is here. And the angle which is formed over here is the right angle. The angle which is formed over here is the right angle. Are you all getting? Getting? Okay. So, now see, fall in water level. Here low tide, here low tide, here high tide, here high tide. Here you can see the bulge. So, this is because the attraction of the sun and the moon are not complementary, means same, but at the right angles to each other. They are at the right angle. The pull, the force. Such tides are called as neap tide. When the position of the sun, the earth and the moon or the pull is in the right angle, it is called as the neap tide. Neap tides are a little lower than the average high tides and a little higher than an average low tide. Average means what? Every day the tides take place. So, but neap tide, when the position of the sun and the moon is like this, okay, at that time it is little more. High tide means level of water is high in the high tide and level of water is low in the low tide than the average high tide. Average means every day high tide and low tide is there, then those days when it is neap tide, it is high and low. Understood all of you? So this is neap tide. In spring tide, sun, moon and earth, they are in the sun and moon are in the same direction and the gravitational pull is in the same direction, so it is greater. And when the sun, earth and moon are like this, okay, when it forms right angle, the neap tide takes place. Understood all of you? Clear? Okay. Again I am repeating. On the new moon day and full moon days, the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon act in the same direction, leading to spring tides. Spring tides are higher than the average high tides and lower than the average low tides. Neap tides on the first and third quarter day of each month, the forces of both the sun and the moon operate at right angle of earth, leading to neap tides. Neap tides are little lower than the average high tides and a little higher than the average low tides. Clear?